All right. Thank you so much. Grateful to everyone who came out tonight. Thank you for being with us. And thank you, my dear friend Terrell. How are you feeling?
Good.
Can I get my book back? Thank you. So I am here in gratitude to so many incredible people, including this man here, and I'm going to tell a little story about that. But I want to just share these books, In the Shadow of Stalin. They are a labor of love. This came together from donations in our community. I don't think the Marvel comic universe would rush to make a genocide book. So Ukrainians had to do what we always have to do to keep ourselves alive and to show that we are human. We had to pay to tell our own stories. And a lot of groups out there that are targets of genocide, past and present, know what we're talking about. So I want to thank the Holodomor Research Education Consortium for being a major donor, and then so many other groups that are thanked in this book. And the author royalties are going to the excellent humanitarian group Razum for Ukraine. I was there when Razum was born with Euromaidan. And so their royalties are, and if I ever see a dime from this book, I'm forwarding it to the check to Dora, the president of Razum. And I'm very proud to say that around 200 copies signed individually are going out to members of Congress, thanks to Razum's help knowing which members to prioritize. So, yeah. So we hope this book has a long life of getting into the hands of the people that need it. We hope that there's going to soon be a program where anyone anywhere in the country can donate, can purchase a copy that will then be delivered to a library or classroom of your choice. So we have 30 copies available tonight, which I'll sign. So grab yours while you can. And then go home and buy one for your local library, your kid's school, your niece's school. We want this to get in the hands of the kids because it's going to be a long fight for Ukraine. And we need to really ground people in pop culture and really tell our stories. All right, so we're going to go back to a dark day in winter 2015. I had been working on the Mr. Jones film, getting rejection for years. I was not a NEPO baby. God bless my parents who were born in displaced persons camps, like some of you in the audience. But I did not have Hollywood connections. I did not have an agent. And I had no idea what I was doing with getting my screenplay, my very first one, made. I mean, it's a pretty crazy thing to try to write a screenplay, period, and then try to write it from the perspective of a 27-year-old Welshman in 1933, when I'm very much a California girl. And so I was pretty distraught. I was juggling jobs. I saw a lot of friends that I started with in media shoot way past me to become editors in famous magazines or get their own show on cable TV. And meanwhile, I was just trying to make ends meet. And so I was with Terrell one night in New York City. We were in McSorley's in the East Village, a bar that famously did not invite white people or black people. And there we were, a white woman and a black man, just in McSorley's. And I remember saying to you, just blurting out I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know what I'm doing. And I just was letting it all, I was unloading on you. And you, being the angel on earth that you are, as everyone here sees you as, with all the incredible work that you do for so many people, especially in Ukraine, you said to me, keep going, keep going. And it was you and my mother. And obviously my husband, who's just entered the room late, I noticed, is incredible. He is a natural born feminist from Paris, because they raise him like that there. And he's my saint as well. My dad, I give him a B+. But it was my mom, and it was Terrell, and it was my husband who would scoop me off the ground when I would collapse over the 14 years of trying to make this film. And I want to publicly thank you for that. And around that time, I was working with, so many from Razum in the audience, we were working with a group of Russians in New York City doing these marches in solidarity with Boris Nemtsov, this charismatic resistance leader over in Russia. And he was organizing these anti-war marches. And so we were going to do our own in solidarity in New York City with Russians, Ukrainians, everyone coming together. And the night before that week when we were about to march, it was a night or two before, I was working on my screenplay. I was following Gareth Jones around in my head in the shadow of the Kremlin. I took a break from writing. I checked Twitter, and the first thing I saw was that Boris Nemtsov was gunned down in the shadow of the Kremlin, 4 bullets in his back. And I basically threw out the script that I was working on, and I did a new draft that was just pure rage. And I went to that march with the Russians, with the Ukrainians, everyone together. I saw my Russian friends with this haunted shock in their eyes. I saw the Ukrainians jaunty as ever, because they're used to being assassinated. They're used to, and they just keep bouncing back. They're like, we're just going to come back and redouble. And it was just this extraordinary moment for me where from your support, my family's support, I just said, this movie's going to get made and that's it. And I put a character in the script named Paul Klebb. Paul Klebb was a composite character. The real life Gareth Jones had a mentor named Paul Schaefer who tipped him off, who helped him get the big story in Ukraine. And Paul Schaefer was expelled by the Soviets. He wasn't allowed back in. And Paul Schaefer had a very fascinating story. He clung on to the Berliner Tageblatt as long as he could until the Nazis shut him down. And he ended up in Chicago, I believe, a broken man, feeling like a personal failure for not stopping authoritarianism. So I want to tell anybody in the audience who feels like a personal failure for not stopping authoritarianism, it's not up to you. It's going to take all of us. So don't put it on. It's not, so just don't do what Paul Schaefer did. That's a cautionary tale. I want to just get that out of the way. Because I remind myself all the time when I'm like, damn it. No. It's up to all of us. It's a generational battle. We're here to plant the seeds and get as far as we can so the next generation has it easier. That's what we're doing. So we're in a marathon. All right, so little side note, but where was I? So Paul Schaefer is in the book in Mr. Jones' film, and I named him Paul Klebb after Paul Klebnikov, who was this American journalist for Forbes that was gunned down in Moscow. And I put 4 bullets in his back after Boris Nemtsov. And it was that furious draft of the screenplay that I sent off to Agnieszka Holland in an email with a prayer. And I was told by so many people, don't give your hopes up. She's saying no to so many good scripts right now, especially with big names attached. And it turns out Agnieszka was just as furious as I was, because she said yes to that script right away, and she moved heaven and earth to get it made. And I want to share, in that window of time, in that moment, when I had just spoken with Terrell, and I'd gotten a little pep talk from my dear friend Terrell, and you will hear his voice this evening, I assure you. So in that window of time when it was just me, my little script, and Terrell and my mother and my husband's voice in my ears, I want to just share this essay that I wrote in a heat of rage. And it is probably the only time in my life when I wrote a first draft that remains more or less how it was originally written. And I sent this essay of rage off to a film program. And had been rejected by these super cool film programs for years. So I never got in. Everyone else got in but me. And I was about to, I don't know why I kept throwing these applications in a black hole, but a little voice, maybe it was Terrell's voice, said to me, what if this is the one time you get in? And so I hit send on the application and I got in, and it helped change my life. And so I will read from that essay now, which is now in the book. A 27-year-old Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones traveled to Ukraine in March 1933, where he witnessed the ravaged countryside and interviewed survivors of Stalin's genocide famine, which came to be known as the Holodomor. His eyewitness reporting would meet fierce opposition from the Kremlin, which led a cover-up with the help of leading Western journalists. As one reviewer noted of the film Mr. Jones, directed by Agnieszka Holland, okay, it's had some edits since then, but as one reviewer noted of the film Mr. Jones, directed by Agnieszka Holland, that I wrote and produced to honor my grandfather, Alexei Case, a survivor of the famine, many of the strangest parts of the dramatized story are true. The Soviet regime pressured Western journalists to publish articles labeling Jones a liar. The American reporter Eugene Lyons confessed to being part of the conspiracy to discredit Jones in his 1937 memoir, Assignment in Utopia. The chapter, The Press Corps Conceals a Famine, describes how Lyons and other journalists agreed to damn Jones a liar in their articles, covering up the famine in exchange for protecting their access to the regime. Some journalists, like the notorious hedonist Walter Duranty, didn't have to be pushed too hard. There is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition, Duranty wrote in the New York Times. Ever a social ringmaster, Duranty lived in a big apartment near the Kremlin, was celebrated in the West as our man in Moscow, and had just won the Pulitzer Prize. Who would the world believe? Jones continued to publish articles exposing Stalin's genocide famine, while Duranty brokered official recognition of the Soviet Union by the United States, earning great applause at a banquet at the Waldorf Astoria. There was money to be made helping Stalin modernize his empire. Turning a blind eye was more convenient and lucrative for the West. 2 years later, Jones was murdered in Inner Mongolia, research suggests, with the help of the Soviet secret police. To show the isolation and surreal stress endured by whistleblowers and journalists who have gone too far in the eyes of the powerful, Mr. Jones tells this harrowing true story through images of the hunt. Those who hunt for the truth are often hunted. Gareth Jones loses his initial Boy Scout naivete and takes on a rugged lone wolf quality as he navigates the desperate terrain of famine-ravaged Ukraine and militarized Moscow. The hunger, desperation, and animalistic fight for survival are shown in stark scenes with very little or no dialogue to create a space where instinct talks. During the darkest moments, the only spark is Jones's own determination to rise above the jungle laws. The greed and materialism of this world as he lives for something greater. He ultimately achieves transcendence and immortality through one of George Orwell's greatest works, Animal Farm, which features in the story. Orwell would go on to review Eugene Lyons's damning memoir, Confessing to Journalistic Malpractice, writing a review that could describe Putin's Russia today. It was important for us to include the real-life connection between Jones and Orwell, which included sharing a literary agent and a tenacious gift for speaking truth to power. We wanted to inspire journalists, whistleblowers, artists, and activists to fight like Gareth Jones and not fear death or persecution, because our work of pure intention lives on, helping others in ways we never could imagine, creating a chain of human progress. The world may be evil, but it has been invaded by good. I had no idea how much I needed to hear that tonight. And there's so many incredible people in the audience that I know do such important work that I thought of you while reading this. You know who you are. All right, Terrell, what you got?
No, so I do remember the night, and I was the voice that told you to keep going, and I did tell you that one email would be the one that would be ultimately yes. So for anyone who doesn't know, we met during in 2014 online as a result of disinformation, which is very germane to what we're talking about with Gareth Jones, the person who was seeking truth. And we met digitally online in the pre-Elon Musk Twitter, 2014. And it was just it was an incredible moment that you had this random Ukrainian-American woman and then myself who had recently completed a Fulbright in Ukraine, and we both saw this disinformation going around about the invasion and the Civil War BS, and we found each other fighting lies. And we joined forces, and you created the Digital Maidan, which I helped to help amplify across my platform. And
Digital Maidan was an SOS hashtag for the revolution in Ukraine, launched from my couch in Brooklyn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you amplified it. You did an article on it. You reached out, and we stayed friends ever since. And we spoke at a panel where a Russian oligarch's cousin was like yelling at me, and I went full Ukrainian on him back.
And I told her don't waste her breath, but she continued.
And we've been at it ever since.
And I actually had to drag her out of the room because she just insisted on yelling at this guy and
fact-checking him.
Fact-checking him, there's a such thing as there's a saying, the more I try to teach you, the dumber I get. And so I wasn't going to drop any brain cells on this person, but
We're available for panels.
Yeah. But no, I'm really happy that we finally got this book off because I saw so many versions of the movie. I saw at least 6 different cuts.
He lives on my couch when he's in town.
And I cook you French.
He destroys my kitchen. I'll tell you now. My husband and I keep it inside, Terrell, but you are a messy cook. Amazing cook. But that... This is not the time or place. Amazing cook.
Well, no, I'm not actually.
French.
I do keep it clean. But you bring up the most random stuff.
This French is over.
But I really am happy to be here because you're a sister to me because I really do spend all of my weekends at your place. We do. Yeah, but I think what's really important about this book and the relationship that we built is that what I like about just you as a person is your sense of opening your community. And I think that it's an example of what I wish other Ukrainian communities and people across the board will look. I think that when you're dealing with this big beast, this colonizer, this Russian supremacist network, and because that's what it is, and you can't fight it by yourself. And I think that me coming with my experience, I primarily work my career in Black media, in African American media, and I just happened to build this expertise in Eastern European politics, particularly Ukraine. And how I was drawn to Ukraine randomly it wasn't random, it was actually really intentional. But I had completed a Peace Corps service in Georgia as a volunteer. And Ali, when I was there, and I'm always the only Black person in these programs and in these environments, and it's not mostly racism, it's just really odd. It's some odd encounters, and the way just people engage me is different. And the Georgians would tell me, well, Terrell, they treat us like Black people in Russia. Now, mind you, I'm looking at some Georgian dude who would otherwise be white here. I'm like, I'm literally looking at a white man telling me that he's Black. And it was a complete mind screw. And when I was in Ukraine, I would have Ukrainians come to me and ask, say, well, you understand where we're coming from, right? And I say, absolutely not. And it took me a while of living in the country to appreciate what they're saying. And just kind of tapping onto the book, a story of mine I'll briefly share is that when I was in Lviv, and some of you may have heard me say this story before, but I was with my Fulbright people, colleagues, and maybe 30 of us, and this old man who's probably dead by now, this has happened maybe 15 years ago, he just waded through the crowd and came directly to me, extended his hand, and he said, well, do you speak Russian or Ukrainian? He said Russian because they taught us Russian at the time, and he said, well, do you want to know the history of our country? I mean, what kind of question is that? You just ask somebody on the street, and I said, well, sure. And he said, well, Russians, they want to colonize us, and they want us to be our slaves, right? And he just went on and on and on. And just to see this white face talking about slavery and oppression, it took me a while to misunderstand it. But what I was doing is developing context for Ukrainian people. And I actually had to re-educate myself about how limiting the concept of race means in the American concept when you apply it across the world. And I realized it doesn't apply as neatly. And this man, in this one encounter, gave me context. But I think that what you're doing, it provides context, right? And I was at an event yesterday where I was saying that we have more context for Russia's lies than Ukrainians' truth. And what you're doing in resurrecting Gareth Jones is that you're adding context to, for Ukraine. Because one thing that we don't have, I think that for Ukraine, beyond military needs is popular imagination. We understand, many people, we have a context for France, even though many of us will never go. We have a context for Spanish food and cuisine, even for those people who will never go. And cinema, we don't have that for Ukraine. And so what your book is doing and what your film did was to add to that ecosystem. And I'm just happy that I could cheerlead you on.
Oh, you're an angel. Well, you know that those two cute girls that took a picture of us in front of the Institute when we first got here? Because there's our photo on the top in front of the Institute, so we got excited and we stopped these strangers on the street to take a photo. I started telling her what our event is about, and she's like, oh, I just saw this film where there's a big scene of Waldorf Astoria and the Russians were there. I'm like, that's my film. So this random, is that crazy? Wow. So I want to go through some photos from the book, and I want to just share that by knowing this story of Gareth Jones, it gives you X-ray vision into the news today. It's media literacy. It's the reason why in 2015, 2016, we were part of a select small group in the media that was screaming very early on to a lot of great risk to ourselves, physically, professionally, about Trump and Russia. Oh, yeah. And so it's very important to understand how the media operates. And because of Gareth Jones and Eugene Lyons, who you're going to see in these images, like I saw the Walter Durantes of today, I still see them, and I see the Eugene Lyonses. The Eugene Lyons type in the media is the one that goes along to get along. They just want to get their check. And so they keep their head down and they follow the crowd and they commit the sin of access journalism. They're conformists. We made this movie because they're the worst. The Walter Durantes are easy to spot. It's the Tucker Carlsons out there. Like, I didn't need the DOJ indictments to know that Benny Johnson and Tim Pool are paid off by the Kremlin, getting hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. I know by what they say. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
I wish me and Mike, we do so much good stuff. We could get
give us $400,000, okay? I got a Patreon, Terrell is a Substack, all right? And so it's really the conformists in the media that drive us crazy, and that Agnieszka was always talking about. It's the conformists that are the worst evil. So if you want X-ray vision, read the book, watch the film, and so we're going to unpack it with these slides. So here you have Gareth Jones checking into the Hotel Metropole, which was the hangout where all the journalists, the Western press, were stuck. It was like Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. They weren't allowed outside. The Ukraine was completely cordoned off. And so here is Gareth checking in, learning that they want him to check out because he's an outsider. They don't trust him, and so they want to control him. And this is Gareth, first day in Moscow, running into Eugene Lyons. And this is true because Eugene Lyons, what happened was Gareth came to town and he ruined the party. They're all having such a great time and getting away with it. And they were considered the window for the world. But with Gareth publishing what he did, that they're all lying, and Gareth did it in such a polite way. He just published the truth. And by the truth being out there, that meant the rest were lying. And so these guys didn't last long after Gareth did that. They eventually understood that history was going to catch up to them. So they started leaving. Even Durante eventually had to leave. And so Eugene Lyons was one of the first to leave. And he decided to cash in by switching sides. And he wrote that book, Assignment in Utopia, with a chapter, The Western Press Conceals a Famine, which I read about in the essay. And Orwell, of course, reviewed it. And Orwell's review sounds exactly like he's writing about Putin's Russia today. And it's such an incredible scene. You can just Google it. Just get this book. So you can get the name of the essay in that essay I read. Google that essay. Read Eugene Lyons' original essay about what they did to Gareth Jones. It will make the hair stand up on the back of your neck what they did to him. They got together in a hotel suite in the Metropole, which you just saw, that fancy hotel. They were all in a suite and it was all these famous Western reporters. The chief Soviet censor was there. The Soviets had just taken hostage a handful of British businessmen. Sound familiar? WNBA player, Wall Street Journal reporter. They're just like what Russia's doing today, taking these hostages. The Soviets did it back then. They take those hostages to blackmail and to force the West to submit and to create a scandal, to create attraction, to create a shiny object over here, to distract from what was really going on in Ukraine. And so in that hotel suite in the Metropole Hotel, the chief Soviet censor, along with all these other big journalists like Eugene Lyons, made a deal that the Western press would get access to the Soviets putting these British engineers that they had just arrested, taken hostage. They're going to be put on a Stalinist trial, and the reporters would get access to it. It was now the biggest story in the world, distracting from what was happening in Ukraine. And they brokered that deal. And all they had to do was go back to their newspapers saying that Gareth Jones was lying, and they did. And that's such an important fact of history that people have to understand. That is how the media treats its own. It is so dangerous to practice journalism. Most of what's out there is not real journalism. It's just not. All these journalists are going around in their minds thinking they're cosplaying Woodward and Bernstein. They're not. It's yellow journalism today. It's sensationalism. It's high school cafeteria, shallow, petty nonsense. We're being robbed. We're absolutely being robbed of our oxygen to help society run and to make smart decisions. And it makes, if you feel confused, if you feel anxious, it's because the media establishment of today is letting you down. That's why. And the good journalists out there are few and far between. I would say ProPublica is solid. There's some really good journalists there that are doing the Lord's work. But I don't have much else beyond that to recommend. Certainly not the New York Times. And it's so sad to see this history repeating because, like I said in my essay, this was supposed to be a monument to my grandfather when it started all those years ago. It was never supposed to be.
And it's always those voices that are that tend to be singular in number, but carry more weight in the history afterwards, right? So when you talk about the disinformation, one of the leading groups of people who was sounding the alarm on that were Black women online. They were actually the number one people who were talking about disinformation, who get virtually no credit for it, because quite frankly, Black people in the city, we know a shitstorm when we see it. But namely, it's that Russian disinformation has targeted Black people over the decades. And so, and a lot of it is based on the fact that they assume, a lot of Russian disinformation is predicated on the notion that they, one, extreme stereotypes, and also just playing on the fact that you're stupid. And another story that kind of ties into to Gareth Jones was that of a great American writer, Langston Hughes. And like you, Andrea, he had struggled to get into the major outlets and become an editor at the major publications. And so he was lured to Moscow to produce a film called Black and White. It was a propaganda film. And he and say about a few dozen other Black people were invited to come in to be actors and singers, et cetera. Right around the time that Gareth Jones was going around, telling the truth about Ukraine. Now, when Langston Hughes went to Moscow, and eventually he got the script that was pre-written by the Soviet miners. He looked at it, and it was basically about an industry baron in the South who was abusing Black people, and then the Black people organized together, et cetera. The short version of this, but there was a part of the story that didn't make sense. One was that one of the white organizers was dancing with his Black maid. And Langston said, in the 1930s in Alabama, this is not happening. And also, part of the script required a lot of singing and dancing. None of the Black people, with the exception of one, could sing or dance. But the Soviets made the assumption that because they were Black that they could. Okay? And so the point of this is that it's a true story. I Wonder As I Wander. He breaks this down in great detail in his autobiography. But what ended up happening was that Langston challenged the Soviet miners and censors. And so even though he was looking at the opportunity there, but one thing that Langston Hughes would not compromise in his quest to be recognized recognized in Moscow because he couldn't be recognized in America, he wouldn't lie, right? And they ended up not publishing the film for a wide range of reasons, but Langston ended up being screwed by the Soviets as well, even though he thought that they were going to save him. And so it really but he took a stand and he stood for the truth. And even against a country that abused him, he would not lie and he would get there with the truth. And so the Soviets have this history of if they can't threaten you, they lure you in with other means, and when they can fool you, when that doesn't fool you, they end up essentially discarding you.
Yeah, my mother is a writer who writes about the mob in America, and she always said if the mob can't buy you, they kill you, and that's how the Kremlin operates and has throughout for generations. All right, so here we have conformist Eugene Lyons. And he is sweeping Gareth off. Oh, see the bald guy and the guy with the nice hair. Those are the British engineers who are they're having a grand old time, as all these Westerners did in Moscow. And this is before they're about to be arrested as pawns by the Kremlin. And then those gentlemen take Gareth to Walter Duranty's palatial apartment in the heart of Moscow, which is where all the celebrities of the day would flock to see the wonders of the great socialist experiment. And it was very much like this. Walter Duranty would go to parties. I read one account where he went to some avant-garde party where a boy and a girl, presumably Russian, Ukrainian, who knows, were being bricked inside a wall. A living boy and girl were being bricked inside a wall, and people thought that was so entertaining, including Duranty. These people were absolute hedonists, materialistic, like Russia's ruling elite of today. And luckily for Ukrainians and for history, Gareth Jones didn't drink. And so he was sober throughout all of this and very bored. And he basically interviewed all these guys, got their stories, including Duranty. And he was a young man with a lot of confidence, a very moral force of good values in his heart and mind. He was raised right by his mother, who was a young, adventurous woman ahead of her time that worked as a young governess, teaching English for the great Welsh industrialist John Hughes, who founded Donetsk. And so Gareth grew up with her stories of adventure in Ukraine. So Ukraine to Gareth Jones was mom. Ukraine to Gareth Jones was mom. He felt a strong attachment there, and he'd been there 3 times. This was his 3rd trip. And so he was going to use that strong heart and mind of his to talk his way through the front door. He goes to the Soviets. He says, "Oh, I hear you're building all these wonderful things. Flattery will get you anywhere, everywhere." And so he convinces them to send him on an official trip into Ukraine to a factory. And before he gets to Kharkiv, he gets off in the middle of nowhere and walks for weeks and weeks and weeks and sees ghost village after ghost village and interviews the survivors on the verge of death and comes out and blows the lid on this huge story. And I just want to highlight the Duranty scenes. If you look at this, do you see like that burnt orange and brown? It's a party in hell. It's a party in hell. They're in hell. That's meant to be claustrophobic and dark and suffocating. You can feel like the sweat and the heat and the smoke of that room. It's hell. But when you get into Ukraine, it's all white for the snow, for the winter, for the purity of what these blameless victims were going through. And so you have it's black and white, good versus evil, the dark forces versus the Mother Nature, because it's totally unnatural what the Soviets did. Look at that guy. He was one of the hardest, Walter Duranty was one of the hardest people to write in the entire screenplay, because the more I learned about him, the more I hated him. And you can't write someone you hate. You see him here, and he got his maid pregnant, abandoned her and the child behind when he finally fled Moscow, and his contemporaries were shocked. They tried to feed the child for him when Duranty wanted nothing to do with him. So when we had to do the legal clearance check to see if any of Duranty's relatives would come after us, we're like, oh, no, he abandoned his son, we're safe. It was like that. And he would say things all the time. Like he said one time, Eugene Lyons quoted Duranty saying that there's 10 million that were killed in the famine, 10 million. And he said, but who cares? They're only Russians. Pass the potatoes. He would say that as casually in dinner parties. Look at that man. And this is this is Gareth's escort on the trip that Gareth ditches. And my dad and mom had gone to the Soviet Union, I think in the 70s. And when my dad read this scene in the screenplay, he said that's exactly what the handlers are like, that latch on to the foreigners and follow you around.
Was it harder? Do you think that your depiction of him is harsher in the graphic novel versus the film, or vice versa? What's your?
I think it's harsher in the graphic novel because Peter Sarsgaard, who plays him in the film, is a Pisces. And Peter is like so watery as a personality. I used to call him Mr. Xanax. And like, he was just so cool and just a lovely, lovely, watery person. And he brought such he made Duranty like a hippie, like a free love hippie. And like, it was so funny because if you want to know how they do nudity on set, because we just had a forest of naked extras just filling the halls of this giant apartment in Poland on a hot spring day. And they're all naked, all walking around naked, except for Peter, who had some like cowboy stirrups on to cover his penis. And like, it was so funny to watch. Like, I got out of there. I only went on that set that day when I really needed to talk to Agnieszka. But like, it was funny to see like Peter just kept getting more and more Mick Jagger, take after take after take. And you kind of see it in the cut. But yeah, so obviously the film has such a sympathetic edge to Durante, thanks to my favorite Pisces.
You said something earlier about him saying, well, if they die, they're just Russians.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting part to me because
it's like how Jake Sullivan sees Ukrainians.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, because it kind of plays into how there are levels to whiteness, per se, you know, in Europe. And that's a very important thing that I do when I talk about Ukraine. And people presume that there's this one blob. You know, I naively and ignorantly thought that when I first learned about the Russians' really discriminatory attitudes towards Ukrainians, I was like, oh my God, I thought all white people got along with each other, right? And you know, I say this because when I talk to my friends back in my hometown of Detroit, and you get beyond this community, those are where the questions lie, and that's where the education starts. And so that's why I was asking, you know, like those simple things add context that we need to know, and that goes back into adding the Ukrainian context and just mentioning that, you know, he made the statement about Russians, but you can also be included towards Ukrainians because you're considered lesser more.
Well, Walter Durante was born and raised in Liverpool, England, which was like a slave center. It was like a big power city in the whole institution of slavery. And he was also, in school, he volunteered to be a police officer and be an informant for the school and get kids in trouble where they'd get caned.
Did you bring it to you?
Yeah, I think that's mine. I don't remember. I think.
I tried to steal it, but.
Oh yeah. Anyway, that's how close we are. But Durante was always on the side of power. And that's what you have to look out for with journalists, is who's on the side of power and who's on the side of truth. And if you want to know what's going on with the New York Times right now, and there's going to be a protest, check out Holly Atkinson, who's in the second row there. She has a great group called Media and Democracy Project. They do all sorts of events to help teach media literacy and organize protests. And she's going to be involved with a group that's going to be protesting the New York Times on Wednesday morning, handing out flyers, standing up against their normalization of Trump's fascism. And so the New York Times are doing what they're doing because they're not the newspaper of record. The New York Times is the newspaper of power. They're on the side of power. And I hope that clears things up for people, because our number one weapon against them is clarity, is staying grounded in the facts and the truth. And you get there by knowing your history, by knowing stories like this.
And they're really eroding our understanding of truth. And I say this as somebody, I have a master's degree in journalism. My first job was my first job was working at National Public Radio, a local affiliate in Urbana-Champaign. So I definitely believe in the institution of journalism. But even as a working journalist now, I don't really trust mainstream media outlets precisely because it's operating on this all sides are equal and all sides need to be heard. And that's not true. and I'll never forget when I was covering the first election, the election in 2016, and Mike, my partner here, we were working together, interestingly enough, and I told my editors I refused to cover Trump. One, I wouldn't maintain my professionalism. And two, I just had no interest in navigating this lying ecosystem that was further perpetuated by mainstream media in organizations like the New York Times. And you see it worse when in debates where they're not properly fact-checked, or last one they did. But the thing that we don't have in this country is media literacy. And what is left up to people like us with our platforms to ultimately do it, and it speaks to why you should support Gaslit Nation and Black Diplomats Official, my YouTube channel, because we have to really invest in outlets and independent journalists who are invested in giving you truth, and they tell you and are not invested in this. All sides need to be heard, because they definitely don't.
Nope.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions?
Yes.
So we'll take any questions if anyone has any. I don't know.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what audiences are you looking to reach, and what are you in through the different mediums. So you've got the film.
Mm-hmm.
Both of you have your platforms on various sort of social media, YouTube, more short form writing. Now this graphic novel, what are the sort of audiences telling you, and how are they different? And how do you what are you learning from each of them that's suggesting how you're getting your message across?
I think, well, Terrell and I were talking about this on the way over here. I think all of us who do democracy, human rights work, one thing you have to center is the fact that there is a loneliness epidemic. The loneliness epidemic is real, and it's people that you know, everyone's impacted by it. Social media is performative. There's a lot of people who are laid off, especially across media and journalism. I can't stress enough that journalism media has been decimated. The jobs are just disappearing. A lot of people that got me my big break at Condé Nast, they're now pushed into entirely new industries. And journalists don't talk enough about that because there's a lot of shame with it. So now they turn to content, Instagram, and they produce content to get eyeballs and get money. And it's a new thing that's not studied enough, but it's like this new growing economy that's only going, it's saturated, right? And so at the heart of it's not real connection, because everyone's performing for dollars. And I find it a bit sad sometimes, but at the heart is people are craving real human connection and community, person to person, vulnerability, kindness. I'm safe with you. And so that's what we try to foster on Gaslit Nation with our listeners, include their voice on the show, just events, virtually in person, just like we're here for you, and just acknowledge feelings that we all have. We're being hit by so many crises right now. We're going through collective trauma that's being compounded by new crises. And so people are really on edge, and they're anxious and they're hurting, and they just want to be heard and seen and felt and hugged in some way, and know they're not alone. So I think that's number one for all the work that we do. It's so essential and important, and we need it. We always check in with each other. And if there's a particularly tough episode we're going to record for Gaslit Nation, we spend time checking in with each other, hugging each other. I feel really badly that I said Terrell's a messy cook. He's not that messy. My husband's just got OCD, okay? I'm very sorry, Terrell. I love you. And you're an amazing, and your dishes are straight up French, okay? You really nailed the landing.
I'm going to leave that alone.
Okay, I'm messy according to my husband, all right? Anyway, so and that's number one. Number two is it's a national security failure that one of two major political parties in America has been overtaken by the Kremlin. And those DOJ indictments were just the tip of the iceberg. All of those members of Congress that voted to block Ukraine aid for 6 critical months so that the Kremlin could regain the advantage on the battlefield should all be investigated. They should all be investigated. And we don't need, I want to just put the mic up real close. We don't need new laws to bring them all to justice. We need the Department of Justice and the FBI to enforce the laws we already have. And they're not doing that. And that is why we're in this democracy crisis. Enforce the laws we already have, number one, okay? And so all that noise that's happening in the media, bullshit Ukraine fatigue, which isn't true, that's a lie. So many of my listeners around the world latch on to Gaslit Nation because they are obsessed with wanting to know what's happening with Ukraine. They need Ukraine to win. Ukraine has won hearts and minds across this country. There is someone in the audience here tonight who I met at a play date in Prospect Park, and he said he's not Ukrainian at all. He's in fact from England, and he said to me, the first thing I do in the morning when I wake up is I check the news on Ukraine for 2 hours, and whichever candidate is going to help Ukraine, that's the one that gets my vote. I'm like, you're on my guest list, okay? You're coming to my events. You're family now. And so there's a lot of people like that around the world who are are diehard Ukraine. There's more of them, far more of them. So I don't want all the Ukraine folks out there to lose hope because of the horrible noise in the media. The horrible noise in the media is failure of justice. It's justice denied. It's a systemic failure of our media and our justice system to stop the disinformation chambers. Like Elon Musk, who should never have been allowed to buy Twitter backed by Russian oligarch money. Yes, these sanctioned Russian oligarchs use their children to do it, but that's how the architecture works over there. So we're in this problem because we're in this crisis because our government's not protecting us, and Ukraine is as well. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to. So my job is to find a sense of connection that we can all share. I believe it is. So the audiences that I look for, and I say this as somebody who travels around the country, is people who don't have the type of access to Ukraine. So I step outside of this community. And so I would like to say that a lot of the people who traditionally talk about Ukraine, the think tankers, et cetera, are very good at what they do, but there's a cap on that population. So I would say a lot of the traditional people talk to the traditional groups. I would like to say I talk to everybody else as well. And I think that people are tired of this ecosystem where it's so much tension and fighting and hatred. And people generally want to know, how can I better connect with other human beings? And so the work that I do is, a lot of it is motivated by the elephant in the room. How does this black dude that was born not only in Detroit, Michigan, but dirt poor, boys in the hood part of Detroit find itself in Ukraine? And I tell them about my own growth story of how I evolved into that. But so much of my experience as a black person whose family comes from the Jim Crow South and has a history of redlining in my neighborhood and been disenfranchisement, I think about how racist urban planning plays into colonialism and apply that to Ukraine. And I have a theme in my work, which is we all need to be invested in each other's safety and security. And I say that because when you think about the length of time, the time that it took for the military aid to finally be approved this spring, I know, and y'all work with me here, I think the reason why it took so long, it was indirectly a result of white supremacy. And I'll say it briefly, is that usually the MAGA first theme and mantra is designed for white people who feel like their whiteness is being devalued. And anything that's not going to the white man in particular in America means that you're taking from me and it's going someplace else. And that hatred is usually directed towards people like me, black folks, Latino people. We all expect it. But with Ukraine, the attitude is, what are we doing why is my money that's supposed to go to my white survival going to those people over there? Right? And that and it doesn't matter if Ukrainians look like them or can integrate into the society and look like them. That money that's going for Ukraine's survival means that it's taking away from my ability to live. I'm fighting my own race war here. And so Putin doesn't seem all that bad when he's not seen, because Putin is a supremacist just like them. And so the racism that targets me, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, and those extremist people, that hatred indirectly impacts Ukrainians as well. Because it's a cancer and it hurts everybody. Mm-hmm. Which is why I always preach this talk, and I say it on the show, I say it in the theme of all my videos, is that if we're not invested in each other's safety and security, then we're all going to find ourselves with a weak spot that some bad force is going to be able to take advantage of. And that really calls for us to become stronger and learn more about one another and find ways where the Ukrainian story could be everyone's story and my story could become yours.
Please.
First of all, thank you for sharing. So I really find it fascinating. The question is actually to both of you. and I'm really interested in your commentary on the recent show documentary at the Toronto Film Festival.
Oh, yeah.
By a Russian director who stated that she is against the war, but she wanted to show the Russian soldiers' side. And given what you said, I want to see both sides, especially in this conflict. But I'm interested in your commentaries.
That was so the film Russians at War by Anastasia Trofimova, which was brilliantly shut down by protests at the Toronto Film Festival. But then they were still screening it. And the Toronto Film Festival played the victim, claiming they had to stop screenings because there were security threats. And then the local police department quickly assured the public in a statement saying there are no security threats, which showed that the Toronto Film Festival got called out for falling for a brilliant production of Russian propaganda. It is exactly what Hannah Arendt would have described, which is it's not about convincing you of a certain position, it's about confusing you. And that's exactly what Russians at War did. It's narrated by the filmmaker. She's standing in Russian-occupied Donbass, where my mother's family's from, which suffered greatly during this famine. And she's standing on this Russian-occupied land saying, this land is also, maybe it's either new Russia or it's part of Russia or it's Ukraine. It all depends on your point of view. No, it doesn't. It depends on facts. It depends on international law. So right away, she's telling you this is Russian disinformation. And the fact that Canadian film funds, French film funds, the Venice Film Festival, and we all know people that follow corruption, autocracy, Italy's mobbed up with Russian money. All those oligarchs have houses there. And so I'm not surprised by the Venice Film Festival opening up the gateway to this. But there's a lot of international institutions that were caught with their pants down when it came to normalizing this Russian disinformation. It's the story of Mr. Jones. So what you brought up is very much the story of Mr. Jones and how they manipulate us so easily.
And then it's also a thing in the West where forced unity is often applied to Ukraine. So there are the kind of the good doers of the world that say, well, you know, these are the good Russians over here, right? And it's kind of like when people tell me, well, these are, you know, like my grandmother would tell me about like the good white folks on the side of the track. They may not hang you, but they're in the crowd, you know, like kind of looking and cheering you on, don't say anything. And I bring that example because I don't think if you're not in Ukraine as often as I am and live there, I don't think you really appreciate how visceral it really is to wake up in the morning and deal with Russian missile strikes that are so illuminating and so bright, it looks like the 4th of July. And I'm not exaggerating, like that's how it literally looks. The high rises across the street from me, they literally illuminate because of the explosions from the interceptors. Shooting down missiles. And I say this as somebody who's almost killed by a Russian missile strike. I say as somebody who regularly sees these drones fly into buildings and civilian locations, multiple occasions. And then also you have this issue where where in the West, there's a lot of Russian integration of their thinking in our society, across even in the universities where there are Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies programs. You notice that the Russian starts first, right? And so it took Ukrainians in 2014 to say, you know what? You should spell Kyiv properly. You should, and then also, Russian is not our native language. It sounds simplistic, but this is the looking down on and superiority concepts. This is the stuff that Black people have dealt with all the time. And we have these conversations that basically this is the Russian equivalent of that. And when you live in a country like America that also has its supremacist history, it also embraces it indirectly, even though they overwhelmingly support it. And so it doesn't surprise me because in addition to Russia's own supremacist networks and functions, it really integrates into our own. And so it takes advantage of the ways that we in America, in the West, have marginalized its own minorities for the sake of recognizing power at the expense of the minority voice.
There are many still I see that support Trump, and I can't understand how they can compromise that. How do they?
I know.
Okay.
We're going to fight over this question.
I'm going to jump in quickly because I have a mic.
Yeah.
And we're a 501c3 organization. We're nonpartisan, so I don't want to go into sort of Trump and whatever. But I would love to hear your thoughts about why some of the messaging is appealing and attractive, thinking about our Ukrainian background and this sort of post-colonial or in a decolonizing world. If you could keep it in that.
So my next screenplay, which is currently going out to cast and directors, is on Dorothy Thompson. She was the journalist who won the war against the Nazis on the home front, and she destroyed the Elon Musks of her day through the power of the pen. She was a columnist at the Herald Tribune. She got that job because one of her comrades from the suffragist movement had taken over the Herald Tribune. And it was supposed to be a women's column, but it became the column. And she was advising Churchill and FDR and battling this isolationist America First Congress that didn't want to liberate Europe from Hitler. And she wrote an essay that went viral in 2016 when Trump won. And that essay was for Harper's, and it's called Who Goes Nazi? And she describes this game. She writes in the essay, at your next dinner party, here's how to look around and tell who among you would go Nazi if given the opportunity. And in that dinner party, she describes various people. She describes the trust fund baby who is given everything in life and gives himself credit for all his success, even though he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Elon Musk and so many others. She describes like a Jewish man who hates himself and is there because he wants to be on the side of power, thinking he'll save him, like the Jared Kushners. And then she describes the trad wife, the self-hating woman who has internalized patriarchy and feels that she's safest by clinging on to patriarchy, because that's where the power is. And Dorothy Thompson concludes this essay. She says, you see, I know who will go Nazi because I saw it happen twice. I saw it happen in my beloved Austria. That's where she became the first woman in the world to run an international newsroom. And I saw it happen in my beloved Berlin, where she was kicked out because she had done a profile of Hitler making fun of him. And when he became chancellor, one of the first things he did was kick her out of the country. And she said, and I see it happening in America. And she warns the reader, there's just something inside of people. There's just something inside of people. It's human nature. But some Ukrainians support Trump. Some Ukrainians are going to vote for Trump because there's just something, like Agnieszka Holland during the press tour for Mr. Jones, she called it the empathy gene. The danger.
They consider, but I see these people posting constantly and proclaiming that they're Ukrainian patriots. They are working on behalf of Ukraine.
But they hate gay people. They hate trans people. They hate they hate non-white people. They don't, they hate the migrants, the asylum seekers that are coming over because I almost said Hitler, because Putin's puppet in Venezuela is destroying Venezuela. No,
in order to honor what you committed what you're saying. So look, let me tell you this, to put it in a nutshell. All groups of people who can integrate into whiteness, they do it. So notice I talk about whiteness and not white people, right? So let's go beyond the political that went on, what you're saying, in that, as a man, I make a choice to not engage in sexism. I am eligible to participate in sexism whether I want to or not. Everyone in this room, like if you are a white person, you are eligible to participate in whiteness whether you want to or not. You can reject it. It's really simple. The people that you're talking about chose not to reject it. It's not rocket science, okay? And so my best advice to you is be an example of somebody who rejects it, rejects that whiteness. Be that person. And it doesn't matter who you are. And I've had this question when I go around the country. And I use myself as an example as a black man, because black people, we can engage, we can inform, we can participate in isms. And what Andrea's work does, the community that she's built, and the one I'm happy that I'm joining of as a co-host now, is that she's created these safe spaces where you can come up to the mic and have these conversations. And so I'm just happy that Andrea's convened this community of people who have rejected all the isms that are so evil and toxic in this world. And so continue to be the example that you continue to be, and hope that will rub on the other people, but most importantly, protect yourself so that their whiteness doesn't rub off on you.
I was just going to comment, I'm also struggling with this idea of specifically what has motivated so many people over generations to basically betray their own countries for Russia and for the Soviet Union. And I see it, I think about like the Cambridge Five, Soviet spies in the UK. I think we see similar patterns, repeating now, where people seem willing to buy it. And essentially, the way I was going to frame my question is as a kind of spiritual one, like, what is the spirit that essentially Russia is able to infect the world with? But I think you've already given some hints at the answers. It was more, that's what I was going to prompt. Discussion.
I love that question, because Terrell and I are such close friends because we're of the left, but by being ahead of the fashions of being so pro-Ukraine before it was cool to be pro-Ukraine, we got a lot of flack from so many on the left, right? Like we were CIA operatives, whatever they would say. And so I address that tension in Mr. Jones and in the graphic novel, obviously, where there's a scene between Gareth Jones and George Orwell. And Orwell, it's the debate of the left. And what's the left, like the Cambridge Five, were motivated, like so many today, like the Katie Halpers of today, and they were motivated by this stupidity of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it's like America has real problems. We have historic levels of income inequality. We have genocidal racism. We have so many incredible people who are out of work or are facing layoffs. And we have these oligarchs who are living above the law. What is not to be exacerbated about and furious about? So they're looking for something to smash. And so they use the Kremlin to burn it all to hell. And I talked to people on the left in 2016, and they're just like, Trump just needs to win so that we can just burn it all down and rebuild again. I'm like, you understand that's not how it works. Because once a dictator's in, it's going to take generations of people sacrificing their lives to get him out. And look at Venezuela, all those young kids that went out to protest Maduro stealing another election. What happened to them? And so that stupidity is that devil's bargain. It just destroys you in the end. And then in addition to that, you have people who just want the money. And one of the why I keep bringing up the journalism crisis of just decades of layoffs of journalism. Who's going to pay those journalists? The Kremlin, the Saudis and other dictatorships laundering their money through think tanks. Those journalists need to eat. So unless you're going to subsidize and expand NPR and PBS so you can hire all this talent and enforce our public service of journalism, and then expect more Tim Pools, expect more Benny Johnsons, getting paid off by the Kremlin. We need to have greater subsidies from the government for journalism, an expansion of them. That's the only way out of this. Terrell and I should not be begging for dollars to practice journalism. We should be subsidized by, just like fossil fuel companies are subsidized by the government. Like that's what we need to start normalizing. And once you secure America's social safety net and you get rid of that totally valid economic resentment, you're going to have less corruption naturally. The countries in this world that have the strongest social safety net, I'm talking, of course, about the Scandinavian countries, they're also the least corrupt. And they're also the staunchest supporters of Ukraine. And so that's the model of what we need to head towards here in America. And that will fix that problem right up.